welcome back to my channel. I'm the Epileptic Explorer, and tonight we will begin, since this is the month of Star Wars, we will begin a new book titled Darth Bane, Path of Destruction. I've been meaning to read this book for quite some time, and I have the full trilogy. I am very excited to read this book to you guys. I've been trying to look for this book on YouTube to re-listen to it because it's such a good book, and I've yet to find it. So I hope you all enjoy this book. Please comment, please like and subscribe to my channel. I hope you all get to enjoy listening to this book as I'm going to be enjoying reading the book. So let's go ahead and read. This is going to be a new series called Star Wars Presents. So, without further ado, Star Wars Presents Darth Bane, Path of Destruction. Prologue. In the last days of the Old Republic, the Sith, followers of the Force's dark side and ancient enemies of the Jedi Order, numbered only two, one master, one apprentice. Yet it was not always so. 1,000 years before the Republic's collapse and Emperor Palpatine's rise to power, the Sith were legion. Lord Khan, Sith Master and founder of the Brotherhood of Darkness, strode through the gore of the battlefield, a tall shadow in the night's gloom. Thousands of Republic troops and nearly 100 Jedi had given their lives trying to defend this world against his army, and they had lost. He relished their suffering and despair. Even now he could sense it rising up like the stench from the broken corpses scattered about the valley. In the distance, a storm was brewing. As each flash of lightning illuminated the sky, Korriban's great Sith temple was momentarily visible in the distance, a stark silhouette towering over the barren horizon. A pair of figures waited in the center of the slaughter, one human and the other Twi'lek. He recognized them despite the darkness. Cordis and Kopeks, two of the more powerful Sith Lords. Once they had been bitter rivals, but now they served together in Khan's Brotherhood. He approached them quickly, smiling. Cordis, tall and so lean as to appear almost skeletal, smiled back. This is a great victory, Lord Khan. It has been far too long since the Sith have had an academy on Korriban. I sense you are eager to begin training the new apprentices here, Khan replied. I expect you will provide me with many more powerful and loyal Sith adepts and masters in the coming years. Provide you? Kopeks asked pointedly. Don't you mean provide us? Are we not all part of the Brotherhood of Darkness? His question was met with an easy laugh. Of course, Kopeks. A mere slip of the tongue. Kopeks refuses to celebrate in triumph. Cordis noted, he has been like this all night. Khan clasped a hand in the hefty Twi'lek's shoulder. This is a great victory for us, he said. Korriban is more than just another world. It is a symbol. The birthplace of the Sith. This victory sends a message to the Republic and the Jedi. Now they will truly know and fear the Brotherhood. Kopeks shrugged free of Khan's hand and turned away with a flick of the tips of the long laku wound around his neck. Celebrate if you wish. He called over his shoulder as he walked away. But the has only just begun. And that is the end of the prologue. And now we will begin reading chapter 1. Dessel was lost in the suffering of his job, barely even aware of his surroundings. His arms ached from the endless pounding of the hydraulic jack. Small bits of rock skipped off the cavern wall as he bored through, ricocheting off his protective goggles and stinging his exposed face and hands. Clouds of atomized dust filled the air, obscuring his vision, and the screeching whine of the jack filled the cavern, drowning out all other sounds as it burrowed centimeter by agonizing centimeter into the thick vein of cortices woven into the rock before him. Impervious to both heat and energy, cortices was prized in the construction of armor and shielding by both commercial and military interests, especially with the galaxy at war. Highly resistant to blaster bolts, cortices alloys supposedly could withstand even the blade of a lightsaber. Unfortunately, the very properties that made it so valuable also made it extremely difficult to mine. Plasma torches were virtually useless. It would take days to burn away even a small section of cortices-laced rock. The only effective way to mine it was through the brute force of hydraulic jacks pounding it relentlessly away at a vein, chipping the cortices free bit by bit. Cortices was one of the hardest materials in the galaxy. The force of the pounding quickly wore down the head of a jack, blunting it until it became almost useless. The dust clogged the hydraulic pistons, making them jam. Mining cortices was hard on the equipment, and even harder on the miners. Dez had been hammering away for nearly 6 standard hours. The jack weighed more than 30 kilos, and the strain of keeping it raised and pressed against the rock face was taking its toll. His arms were trembling from the exertion. His lungs were gasping for air and choking on the clouds of fine mineral dust thrown up from the jack's head. Even his teeth hurt. The rattling vibration felt as if it were shaking them loose from his gums. But the miners on Apatros were paid based on how much cortices they brought back. If he quit now, another miner would jump in and start working at the vein, taking a share of the profits. Dez didn't like to share. The whine of the jack's motor took on a high pitch, becoming a keening wail Dez was all too familiar with. At 20,000 RPM, the motor sucked the dust like a thirsty bantha sucking up water after a long desert crossing. The only way to combat it was by regular cleaning and servicing, and the Outer Rim Ore Works company preferred to buy cheap equipment and replace it rather than sinking credits into maintenance. Dez knew exactly what was going to happen next, and a second later, it did. The motor blew. The hydraulics seized with a horrible crunch, and a cloud of black smoke spit out the rear of the jack. Cursing ORO and its incorporate policies. Dez released his cramped finger from the trigger and tossed the spent piece of equipment to the floor. "Move aside, kid," a voice said. Gerd, one of the other miners, stepped up and tried to shoulder Dez out of the way so he could work the vein with his own jack. Gerd had been working the mines for nearly 20 standard years, and it had turned his body into a mass of hard, knotted muscle. But Dez had been working the mines for 10 years himself. Ever since he was a teenager, and he was just as solid as the older man, and a little bigger. He didn't budge. I'm not done here, he said. "Jack died, that's all. Hand me yours and I'll keep at it for a while." "You know the rules, kid," You stop working, and someone else is allowed to move in. Technically, Gerd was right, but nobody ever jumped another miner's claim over an equipment malfunction. Not unless he was trying to pick a fight. Des took a quick look around. The chamber was empty except for the two of them, standing less than half a meter apart. Not a surprise. Des usually chose caverns far off the main tunnel network. It had to be more than mere coincidence that Gerd was here. Des had known Gerd for as long as he could remember. The middle-aged man had been friends with Hurst, Dez's father. Back when Des first started working the mines at 13, he had taken a lot of abuse from the bigger miners. His father had been the worst tormentor, but Gerd had been one of the main instigators, dishing out more than his fair share of teasing, insults, and the occasional cuff on the ear. Their harassments had ended shortly after Dez's father died of a massive heart attack. It wasn't because the miners felt sorry for the orphaned young man, though. By the time Hurst died, the tall, skinny teenager they loved to bully had become a mountain of muscle with heavy hands and a fierce temper. Mining was a tough job. It was the closest thing to hard labor outside a Republic prison colony. Whoever worked the mines on Apparatus got big, and Des just happened to become the biggest of them all. Half a dozen black eyes, countless bloody noses, and one broken jaw in the space of a month was all it took for Hurst's old friends to decide they'd be happier if they left Des alone. Yet, it was almost as if they blamed him for Hurst's death, and every few months one of them tried again. Gerd had always been smart enough to keep his distance, until now. I don't see any of your friends here with you, old man, Des said. So back off my claim, and nobody gets hurt. Gerd spat on the ground at Des's feet. You don't even know what day it is, do you, boy? Griffin disgrace is what you are. They were standing close enough to each other that Des could smell the sour Corellian whiskey on Gerd's breath. The man was drunk enough to come looking for a fight, but still sober enough to hold his own. 5 years ago today, Gerd said, shaking his beard sadly. 5 years ago today your father died, and you don't even remember. Des rarely even thought about his father anymore. He hadn't been sorry to see him go. His earliest memories were of his father smacking him. He didn't even remember the reason. Hurst rarely needed one. Can't say I miss him, Hurst, the same way. I miss Hurst the same way you do, Gerd. Hurst? Gerd snorted. He raised you by himself after your mama died. And you don't even have the respect to call him Dad? You ungrateful son of a cockhound. Des glared down menacingly at Gerd, but the shorter man was too full of drink and self-righteous indignation to be intimidated. Should have expected this from a mud-crutch whelp like you, Gerd continued. Hurst always said you were no good. He knew there was something wrong with you, Bane. Des narrowed his eyes, but didn't rise to the bait. Hurst had called him by that name when he was drunk. Bane. He had blamed his son for his wife's death. Blamed him for being stuck on Apparatus. He considered his only child to be the bane of his existence. A fact he tended to spit out at Des in his drunken rages. Bane. It represented everything spiteful, petty, and mean about his father. It struck at the innermost fears of every child. Fear of disappointment, fear of abandonment, fear of violence. As a kid, that name had hurt more than all the smacks from his father's heavy fists. But Dez wasn't a kid anymore. Over time, he learned to ignore it, along with all the rest of the hateful bile that spilled from his father's mouth. I don't have time for this, he muttered. I've got work to do. With one hand, he grabbed the hydraulic jack from Gerd's grasp. He put the other hand on Gerd's shoulder and shoved him away, stumbling back. The inebriated man caught his heel on a rock and fell roughly to the ground. He stood up with a snarl, his hands balling into fists. Guess your daddy's been gone too long, boy. You need someone to beat the sense back into you. Gerd was drunk, but he was no fool, Dez realized. Dez was bigger, stronger, younger, but he'd spent the last 6 hours working on a hydraulic jack. He was covered in grime and sweat was dripping off his face. His shirt was drenched. Gerd's uniform, on the other hand, was still relatively clean. No dust, no sweat stains. He must have been planning this all day, taking it easy and sitting back while Dez wore himself out. But Dez wasn't about to back down from a fight. Throwing Gerd's jack to the ground, he dropped into a crouch, feet wide and arms held out in front of him. Gerd charged forward, swinging his right fist in a vicious uppercut. Dez reached out and caught the punch with the open palm of his left hand, absorbing the force of the blow. His right hand snapped forward and grabbed the underside of Gerd's right wrist. As he pulled the older man forward, Dez ducked down and turned, driving his shoulder into Gerd's chest. Using his opponent's own momentum against him, Dez straightened up and yanked hard on Gerd's wrist, flipping him up and over so that he crashed to the ground on his back. The fight should have ended right then. Dez had a split second where he could have dropped his knee onto his opponent, driving the breath from his lungs and pinning him to the ground while he pounded Gerd with his fists, but it didn't happen. His back, exhausted from hours of hefting the 30-kilo jack, spasmed. The pain was agonizing. Instinctively, Dez straightened up, clutching at the knotted lumbar muscles. It gave Gerd a chance to roll out of the way and get back to his feet. Somehow, Dez managed to drop into his fighting crouch again. His back howled in protest, and he grimaced as red-hot daggers of pain shot through his body. Gerd saw the grimace and laughed. Cramping up there, boy. You should know better than to try and fight after a 6-hour shift in the mines. Gerd charged forward again. This time his hands weren't fists, but claws grasping and grabbing at anything they could find, trying to nullify the younger man's height and reach by getting in close. Dez tried to scramble out of the way, but his legs were too stiff and sore to get him clear. One hand grabbed his shirt and the other got hold of his belt as Gerd pulled both of them to the ground. They grappled together, wrestling on the hard, uneven stone of the cavern floor. Gerd had his face buried against Dez's chest to protect it, giving Dez from landing a solid elbow or headbutt. He still had a grip on Dez's belt, but now his other hand was free and punching blindly up to where he guessed Dez's face would be. Dez was forced to wrap his arm in and around Gerd's own, interlocking them so neither man could throw a punch. With their limbs pinned, strategy and technique meant little. The fight had become a test of strength and endurance. With the two combatants slowly wearing each other down, Dessel tried to roll Gerd over onto his back, but his weary body betrayed him. His limbs were heavy and soft. He couldn't get the leverage he needed. Instead, it was Gerd who was able to twist and turn, wrenching one of his hands free while still keeping his face pressed tight against Dez's chest so it wouldn't be exposed. Dez wasn't so lucky. His face was open and vulnerable. Gerd struck a blow with his free hand, but he didn't hit with a closed fist. Instead, he drove his thumb hard into Dez's cheek, only a few centimeters from his real target. He struck again with the thumb, looking to gouge out one of his opponent's eyes and leave him blind and writhing in pain. It took Des a second to realize what was happening. His tired mind had become as slow and clumsy as his body. He turned his face away just as the second blow landed, the thumb jamming painfully into the cartilage of his upper ear. Dark rage exploded inside Des, a burst of fiery passion that burned away the exhaustion and fatigue. Suddenly his mind was clear, and his body felt strong and rejuvenated. He knew that what he was going to do next. More importantly, he knew with absolute certainty what Gerd would do next too. He couldn't explain how he knew. Sometimes he could just anticipate an opponent's next move. Instinct. Some might have said. Des felt it was something more. It was too detailed, too specific to be simple instinct. It was more like a vision, a brief glimpse into the future, and whenever it happened, Des always knew what to do, as if something was guiding and directing his actions. When the next blow came, Des was more than ready for it. He could picture it perfectly in his mind. He knew exactly when it was coming and precisely where it would strike. This time he turned his head in the opposite direction, exposing his face to the incoming blow and opening his mouth. He bit down hard, his timing perfect, and his teeth sank deep into the dirty flesh of Gerd's probing thumb. Gerd screamed as Des clamped his jaw shut, severing the tendons and striking bone. He wondered if he could bite clean through, and then, as if the very thought made it happen, he severed Gerd's thumb. The screams became shrieks as Gerd released his grasp and rolled away, clasping his maimed hand with his whole one. Crimson blood welled up through the fingers trying to stanch the flow from his thumb. Standing up slowly, Des spat the thumb out onto the ground. The taste of blood was hot in his mouth. His body felt strong and re-energized, as if some great power surged through his veins. All the fight had been taken out of his opponent. Des could do anything he wanted to Gerd now. The older man rolled back and forth on the floor, his hand clutched to his chest. He was moaning and sobbing, begging for mercy, pleading for help. Des shook his head in disgust. Gerd had brought this on himself. It had started as a simple fist fight. The loser would have ended up with a black eye and some bruises, but nothing more. Then the older man had taken things to another level by trying to blind him, and he'd responded in kind. Des had learned long ago not to escalate a fight unless he was willing to pay the price of losing. Now Gerd had learned that lesson too. Des had a temper, but he wasn't the kind to keep beating on a helpless opponent. Without looking back at his defeated foe, he left the cavern and headed back up the tunnel to tell one of the foremen what had happened so someone could come tend to Gerd's injury. He wasn't worried about the consequences. The medics could reattach Gerd's thumb, so at worst Des would be fined a day and two wages. The corporation didn't really care what its employees did, as long as they kept coming back to mine the cortices. Fights were common among the miners, and Oro almost always turned a blind eye. Though this particular fight had been more vicious than most, savage and short, with a brutal end. Just like life on Apparatus. And that's the end of chapter 1. Let me see what we're doing. Alrighty. Just making sure. Alright, so let's go ahead and keep on reading. I hope you all are enjoying this book as I am. Believe me, I could read this book. Well, I have to rest up and try to finish reading the other book too. But that's another time. Yeah. Chapter 2. Chapter 2. Sitting in the back of the land cruiser used to transport miners between Aprotus's only colony and the mines, Des felt exhausted. All he wanted was to get back to his bunk in the barracks and sleep. The adrenaline had drained out of him, leaving him hyper aware of the stiffness and soreness of his body. He slumped down in his seat and gazed around the interior of the cruiser. Normally, there would have been 20 other miners crammed into the speeder with him, but this one was empty except for him and the pilot. After the fight with Gerd, the foreman had suspended Des without pay, effective immediately, and had ordered the transport to take him back to the colony. "This kind of thing is getting old, Des," the foreman had said with a frown. "We've got to make an example of you this time. You can't work the mines until Gerd is healed up and back on the job." What he really meant was, you can't earn any credits until Gerd comes back. He'd still be charged room and board, of course. Every day that he sat around doing nothing could go onto his tab, adding to the debt he was working so desperately to pay off. Des figured it would be 4 or 5 days until Gerd was able to handle a hydraulic jack again. The on-site medic had reattached the severed thumb using a vibroscalpel and synth flesh. A few days of Colto injections and some cheap meds to dull the pain, and Gerd would be back at it. Back to therapy could have back in a day. Could have him back in a day. But Bacta was expensive, and Oro wouldn't spring for it unless Gerd had miner's insurance, which Des highly doubted. Most miners never bothered with the company-sponsored insurance program. It was expensive, for one thing. What with room and board and the fees covering the cost of transport to and from the mines, most thought they gave Oro more than enough of their hard-earned pay without adding insurance premiums onto the stack. It wasn't just the cost, though. It was almost as if the men and women who worked the Cortosis mines were in denial, refusing to admit the potential dangers and hazards they encountered every day. Getting insurance would force them to take a look at the cold, hard facts. Few miners ever reached their golden years. The tunnels claimed many, burying bodies in cave-ins or incinerating them when somebody tapped into a pocket of explosive gases trapped in the rock. Even those who made it out of the mines tended not to survive long into their retirement. The mines took their toll. 60-year-old men were left with bodies that looked and felt like they were 90. Broken shells worn down by decades of hard physical labor and exposure to airborne contaminants that slipped through the substandard Oro filters. When Des's father died, with no insurance, of course, all Des got out of it was the privilege of taking on his father's accumulated debt. Hurst had spent more time drinking and gambling than mining. To pay for his monthly room and board, he'd often had to borrow credits from Oro at an interest rate that would be criminal anywhere but in the Outer Rim. The debt kept piling up, month to month and year to year, but Hurst didn't seem to care. He was a single parent with a son he resented, trapped in a brutal job he despised. He had given up any hope of escaping Albatross long before the heart attack claimed him. The Hutt spawn probably would have been glad to know his son had gotten stuck with his bill. The transport sped above the barren rocks of the small planet's flat lands, with no sound but the endless drone of the engines. The featureless waste flew by in a blur until the view out the window was nothing but a curtain of shapeless gray. The effect was hypnotic. Des could feel his tired mind and body eager to drift into deep and dreamless sleep. This was how they got you. Work, work you to exhaustion, dull your senses, numb your will into submission, until you accepted your lot and wasted your life in the grit and grime of the Cortices mines, all in the relentless service of the Outer Rim Ore Works Company. It was a surprisingly effective trap. It worked on men like Gerd and Hurst, but it wasn't going to work on Dez. Even with his father's crushing debt, Dez knew he'd pay Oro off someday and leave this life behind. He was destined from something greater than this small, insignificant existence. He knew this with absolute certainty, and it was this knowledge that gave him the strength to carry on in the face of the relentless, sometimes hopeless grind. It gave him the strength to fight, even when part of him felt like giving up. He was suspended, unable to work the mines, but there were other ways to earn credits. With a great effort, he forced himself to stand up. The floor swayed under his feet as the speeder made constant adjustments to maintain its programmed course cruising altitude of half a meter above ground level. He took a second to get used to the rolling rhythm of the transport, then half walked, half staggered up the aisle between the seats to the pilot at the front. He didn't recognize the man, but they all tended to look the same way: grim, unsmiling features, dull eyes, and always wearing an expression as if they were on the verge of a blinding headache. "Hey," Dez said, trying to sound nonchalant. Any ships, any ships come into the spaceport today?" There was no reason for the pilot to keep his attention fixed on the path ahead. The 40-minute trip between the mines and the colony was a straight line across an empty plain. Some of the pilots even stole naps along the route, yet this one refused to turn and look at Dez as he answered. "Cargo ship touched down a few hours ago," he said in a bored voice. "Military, Republic cargo ship." Dez smiled. "They staying for a while?" The pilot didn't answer. He only snorted and shook his head at the stupidity of the question. Dez nodded and stumbled back toward his seat at the rear of the transport. He knew the answer, too. Cortices was used in the hulls of everything from fighters to capital ships, as well as being woven into the body armor of the troops. And as the war against the Sith dragged on, the Republic's need for Cortices kept increasing. Every few weeks, a Republic freighter would touch down on Apatros. The next day, it would leave again, its cargo base filled with the valuable mineral until then, the crew, officers and enlisted soldiers alike, would have nothing to do but wait. From past experience, Dez knew that whenever Republic soldiers had a few hours to kill, they liked to play cards. And wherever people played cards, there was money to be made. Lowering himself back onto his seat at the rear of the speeder, Dez decided that maybe he wasn't quite ready to hit his bunk after all. By the time the transport stopped on the edges of the colony, Dez's body was tingling with anticipation. He hopped out and sauntered toward his barracks at a leisurely pace. Excuse me. Fighting his own eagerness and the urge to run. Even now, he imagined the Republic soldiers and their credits would be sitting at the gaming tables in the colony's only cantina. Check real quick. Just making sure. Still, there was no point in rushing over there. It was late afternoon. The sun was just beginning its descent beyond the horizon to the north. By now, most of the miners from the night shift would be awake. Many of them would already be at the cantina. while while whiling away the time until they had to make the journey out of the mines to start their shift. For the next 2 hours, Dez knew he'd be lucky to find a place to sit down at the cantina. Never mind finding an empty seat at a pazak or sabak table. Meanwhile, it would be another few hours before the men working the day shift climbed onto the waiting transports to head back to their homes. He'd get to the cantina long before any of them. Back at his barracks, he stripped off his grime-stained coveralls and climbed into the deserted communal showers, scouring the sweat and fine rock dust from his body. Then he changed into some clean clothes and sauntered out into the street, making his way slowly toward the cantina on the far side of town. The cantina didn't have a name. It didn't need one. Nobody ever had any trouble finding it. Albatross was a small world, barely more than a moon with an atmosphere and some indigenous plant life. There was precarious few places to go. The mines, the colony, and the barren wastes in between. The mines were a massive complex encompassing the caves and tunnels dug by Oro, as well as the refining and processing branches of Oro's operations. The spaceports were located there too. Freighters left daily with shipments of Cortruses bound for some wealthier world closer to Coruscant in the galactic core, and incoming vessels bringing equipment and supplies to keep the mines running arrived every other day. Employees who weren't strong enough to mine Cortuses worked in the refining plants or the spaceport. The pay wasn't as good, but they tended to live longer. But no matter where people worked, they all came home to the same place at the end of their shifts. The colony was nothing more than a ramshackle town of temporary barracks thrown together by Oro to house the few hundred workers expected to keep the mines running. Like the world itself, the colony was officially known as Albatross. To those who lived there, it was more commonly referred to as the Muck Huts. Every building was the same shade of dingy gray durasteel, the exterior weathered and worn. The insides of the buildings were virtually identical, temporary workers' barracks that had become all too permanent. Each structure housed 4 small private rooms meant for 2 people, but often holding 3 or more. Sometimes entire families shared one of those rooms, unless they could find the credits for the outrageous rents Oro charged for more space. Each room had bunks built into the walls and a single door that opened onto a narrow hall. A communal bathroom and shower were located at the end. The doors tended to squeak on ill-fitting hinges that were never tended to. The roofs were a patchwork of quick fixes to seal up the leaks that inevitably sprang whenever it rained. Broken windows were taped against the wind and cold, but never replaced. A thin layer of dust accumulated over everything. But few of the residents ever bothered to sweep out their domiciles. The entire colony was less than a kilometer on each square side, making it possibly a walk from any given building to any of the other identical structures in fewer than 20 standard minutes. Despite the unrelenting similarity of the architecture, navigating the colony was easy. The barracks had been placed in straight rows and columns, forming a grind of utilitarian streets between the uniformly spaced domiciles. The streets couldn't exactly be called clean, though they were hardly festering with garbage. Oro cleared trash and refused just often enough to keep conditions sanitary, since an outbreak of diseases bred by filth would adversely affect the mine's production. However, the company didn't seem to mind the collected junk that inevitably accumulated throughout the town. Broken down generators, rusted out machinery, corroded scraps of metal, and discarded, worn out tools crowded the narrow streets between the barracks. There was only two structures in the colony that were in any way distinguished from the rest. One was the Oro Market, the only store on world. It had once been a barracks, but the bunks had been replaced with shelves, and the communal shower area was now a secure storage room. A small black and white sign had been fastened to the wall outside, listing the hours of operation. There were no displays to lure shoppers in, and no advertising. The market stocked only the most basic items, all at the scandalous markups. Credit was gladly advanced against future wages at Oro's typically high interest rate, guaranteeing that buyers would spend even more hours in the mine working off their purchases. The other dissimilar building was the cantina itself, a magnificent triumph of beauty and design when compared with the dismal homogeneity of the rest of the colony. The cantina was built a few hundred meters beyond the edge of the town, set well apart from the gray grind of barracks. It stood only 3 stories high, but because every other structure was limited to a single floor, it dominated the landscape. Not that it needed to be that tall. Inside the cantina, everything was located on the ground floor. The upper stories were merely a facade constructed for show by Groshik, the Nemodian owner and bartender. Above the first floor ceiling, the second and third floors didn't really exist. There were only the rising walls and a dome made of tinted violet glass, illuminated from within. Matching violet lights covered the pale blue exterior walls. On almost any world, the effect would have been ostentatious and tacky, but amid the gray of albatross, it was doubly so. Groshik often proclaimed that he had intentionally made his cantina as garish as possible, simply to offend the Oro powers that be. The sentiment made him popular with the miners, but Dez doubted if Oro really cared one way or the other. Groshik could paint his cantina any color he wanted, as long as he gave the corporation its cut of the profits each week. The 20 standard hour day of apparatus was split evenly between the 2 shifts of miners. Dez and the rest of the early crew worked from 0800 to 1800. His counterparts worked from 1800 to 0800. Groshik, in an effort to maximize profits, opened each afternoon at 1300 and didn't close for 10 straight hours. This allowed him to serve the night crew workers before they started and catch the day crew when that shift was over. He'd close at 0300, clean for 2 hours, sleep for 6, and then get up at 1100 and start the process all over again. His routine was well known to all the miners. The Nemodian was as regular as the rising and setting of Apparatus's pale orange sun. As Dez crossed the distance between the edge of the colony proper and the cantina's welcoming door, he could already hear the sounds coming from inside. Loud music, laughter, chatter, clinking glasses. It was almost 1600 now. The day shift had 2 hours to go before quitting time. But the cantina was still packed with night shift workers looking to have a drink or something to eat before they boarded the shuttles that would take them to the mines. Ugh. Dez didn't recognize any faces. The day and night crews rarely crossed paths. The Patreons, the patrons were mostly humans, with a few Twi'leks, Celestins, and Saurians filling out the crowd. Dez was surprised to notice a Rhodian too. Apparently the night crew were more tolerant of other species than the day shift. There were no waitresses, servers, or dancers. The only employee of the cantina was Groshik himself. Anyone who wanted a drink had to come up to the large bar built into the back wall and order it. Dez pushed his way through the crowd. Groshik saw him coming and momentarily dipped out of sight behind the bar, reappearing with a mug of Gizzard ale just as Dez reached the counter. "You're here early today," Groshik said as he set the drink down with a heavy thud. His low, gravelly voice was difficult to hear above the din of the crowd. His words always had a guttural quality, as if he were speaking from the very back of the throat. The Nemodian liked him, though Dez wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because he'd watched Dez grow up from a young kid to a man. Maybe he just felt sorry Dez had been stuck with such a rankweed of a father. Whatever the reason, there was a standing arrangement between the two. Dez never had to pay for a drink if it was poured without being asked for. Dez gratefully accepted the gift and drowned it in one long draught, then slammed the empty mug back down onto the table. Ran into a bit of trouble with Gerd, he replied, wiping his mouth. I've been sorry. Ran into a bit of Gerd. Trouble with Gerd. Aye. He replied, wiping his mouth. I bit off his thumb, so they let me go home early. Groshik tilted his head to one side and fixed his enormous red eyes on Dez. The sour expression on his amphibian face didn't change, but his body shook ever so slightly. Dez knew him well enough to realize the Nemodian was laughing. Seems like a fair trade, Groshik croaked, refilling the mug. Dez didn't guzzle the second drink as he had the first. Groshik rarely gave him more than one on the house, and he didn't want to abuse the bartender's generosity. He turned his attention to the crowd. The Republic visitors were easy to spot. 4 humans, 2 men, 2 women, and a male Ithorian in crisp navy uniforms. It wasn't just their clothes that made them stand out though. They all stood straight and tall, whereas most of the miners tended to hunch forward as if carrying a great weight on their backs. On one side of the main room, a smaller section was roped off from the rest of the cantina. It was the only part of the place Groshik had nothing to do with. The Oro Company allowed gambling on Apatros, but only if it was in charge of the tables. Officially, there was to keep anyone from cheating, but everyone knew Oro's real concern was keeping the wagers in check. It didn't want one of its employees to win big and pay off all his or her debt in one lucky night. By keeping the maximum limits low, Oro made sure it was more profitable to work the mines than the tables. In the gaming section were four more naval soldiers wearing the uniform of the Republic fleet, along with a dozen or so miners. A Twi'lek woman with the rank of petty officer on her lapel was playing Pazak. A young ensign was sitting at the sabak table, talking loudly to everyone around him, though nobody seemed to be listening to him. Two more officers, both human, one male, one female, also sat at the sabak table. The woman was a lieutenant. The man bore the insignia of a full commander. Des assumed they were senior officers in charge of the mission to receive the Cortusis shipment. I see you've noticed our recruiters, Krochik muttered. The war gets the We're almost there. Believe me, we are almost there. The war against the Sith, officially nothing more than a series of protracted military arrangements, even though the whole galaxy knew it was a war, required a steady stream of young and eager cadets from the front lines. And for some reason, the Republic always expected the citizens on the Outer Rim world to jump at the chances to join them. Whenever a Republic military crew passed through Apatros, the officers tried to round up new recruits. They'd buy a second round of drinks, then use it as an excuse to start up a conversation. Usually about the glorious and heroic life of being a soldier. Sometimes they'd play up the brutality of the Sith. Other times, they'd spin promises of a better life in the Republic military, all the while pretending to be friendly and sympathetic to the locals, hoping a few would join their cause. Des suspected they'd receive some kind of bonus for any new recruit they conned into signing up. Unfortunately for them, they weren't going to find too many takers on Epatros. The Republic wasn't too popular on the Rim. People here, including Des, knew the core worlds exploited small, remote planets like Epatros for their own gain. The Sith found a lot of anti-Republic sympathizers out there on the fringes of civilized space. That was one of the reasons their numbers kept growing as the war dragged on. Despite their dissatisfaction with the core worlds, people still might have signed up with the recruiters if the Republic wasn't so concerned with following the absolute letter of the law. Anyone hoping to escape Epatros and the clutches of the mining corporation was in for a rude awakening. Debts to Oro still had to be paid, even by recruiters protecting the galaxy against the rising Sith threat. If someone owed money to a legitimate corporation, the Republic fleet would garnish his or her wages until those debts were paid. Not too many more miners were excited about the prospect of joining a war only to have the privilege of not getting paid. Sorry. I'm tired. Almost there. Almost there. If someone owed money to a legitimate corporation, The Republic fleet would garnish his or her wages until those debts were paid. Not too many miners were excited about the prospect of joining a war only to have the privilege of not getting paid. Some of the miners resented the senior officers and their constant push to lure native young men and women into joining their cause. It didn't bother Dez, though. He'd listen to them prattle on all night, as long as they kept playing cards. He figured it was a small price to pay for getting his hands on their credits. His eagerness must have shown, at least to Groshek. Any chance you heard a Republic crew was stopping by and then picked a fight with Gerd just so you could get here early? Dez shook his head. No. Just a happy coincidence is all. What angle are they looking for this time? Glory of the Republic?
My orchid 2 hearts.
Grr. Of course she would call me as in the middle of a video. Give me 1 second. Hey, sweetie. Nice. Oh. Well, I was actually a little recording. It's okay. It's alright. It's all good. You doing okay? No worries. Okay. Me too. I'm doing Star Wars Presents. Star Wars Presents. I read Star Wars books, basically. In honor of the name. It's Star Wars. It's Star Wars love. You know, if there's a video right around the corner, it's Star Wars well, that's what I'm doing with this month is that it's Star Wars. Well, I'm gonna be reading this in the same book right now. I don't sure if I'm gonna do it every day, but I'm gonna try to finish it. It's only like 30. I'm almost done. It's the pretty close part. Okay, so yeah. Okay. Sorry. My apologies. Where was I? Oh. Some of the miners resented the senior officers and their constant push to lure, to lure naive young men and women into joining their cause. It didn't bother Dez, though. He listened to them prattle on all night, as long as they kept playing cards. He figured it was a small price to pay for getting his hands on their credits. His eagerness must have shown, at least to Groshek. Any chance? Let's see. Any chance you heard a Republic crew was stopping by and then picked a fight with Gerd just so you could get here early? Oh, sorry. Any chance you heard a Republic crew was stopping by and then picked a fight with Gerd just so you could get here early? Dad shook his head. No, just a happy coincidence is all. What angle are they working this time? Glory of the Republic? Trying to warn us about the horrors of the Brotherhood of Darkness, was the carefully neutral reply, not going over too well. The cantina owner kept his real opinions to himself when it came to matters of politics. His customers were free to talk about any subject they wanted, but no matter how heated their arguments became, he always refused to take sides. Bad for business, he'd explained once. Agree with someone, and they'll be your friend for the rest of your nights. Of the night. Cross them, and they might hate you for weeks. Nemodians were known for their shrewd business sense, and Groshik was no exception. A miner pushed his way up to the bar and demanded a drink. When Groshnik went to fill the order, Des turned to study the gaming area. There weren't any free seats at the sabak table, so for the time being, he was forced into the role of spectator. For well over an hour, he studied the plays and the wagers of the newcomers, paying particular attention to the senior officers. They tended to be better players than enlisted troops, probably because they had more credits to lose. The game on Epitros followed a modified version of the Bespin standard rules. The basics of the game were simple. Make a hand as close to 23 as possible without going over. Each round, a player had to either bet to stay in the hand or fold. Any player who chose to stay in could draw a new card, discard a card, or place a card into the interference field to lock in its value. At the end of any round, a player could come up, revealing his or her hand, and forcing all other players to show their cards as well. Best hand at the table won the hand pot. Any score over 23 or below negative 23 was a bomb out that required the player to pay a penalty. And if the player had a hand that totaled exactly 23, a pure sabak, he or she won the sabak pot as a bonus. But what with random shifts that could unexpectedly change the value of cards from round to round, and other players coming up early, a pure sabak was a lot harder to achieve than it sounded. Sabak was more than a game of luck. It was about strategy and style, knowing when to bluff and when to back down, knowing how to adapt to the ever-changing cards. Some players were too cautious, never betting more than the minimum raise, even when they had a good hand. Others were too aggressive, trying to bully the rest of the table with outrageous bets even when they had nothing. A player's natural tendencies showed through if you knew what to look for. The ensign, for example, was clearly new to the game. He kept staying in with weak hands instead of folding his cards. He was a chaser, not satisfied with cards good enough to collect the hand pot. He was always looking for the perfect hand, hoping to win big and collect the sabak pot that kept on growing until it was won. As a result, he kept getting caught with ball-mount hands and having to pay a penalty. It didn't seem to slow his betting though. He was one of those players with more credits than sense, which suited Des just fine. To be an expert sabak player, you had to know how to control the table. It didn't take Des many hands to realize the Republic commander was doing just that. He knew how to bet big and make other players fold winning hands. He knew when to bet small to lure others into playing hands they should have folded. He didn't worry much about his own cards. He knew that the secret to Sabak was figuring out what everyone else was holding, and then letting them think they knew what cards he was holding. It was only when all the hands were revealed and he was raking into the chips that his opponents would realize how wrong they'd been. He was good, Des had to admit, better than most of the Republic players who passed through. Despite his pleasant appearance, he was ruthless in scooping up pot after pot. But Des had a good feeling. Sometimes he just knew he couldn't lose. He was going to win tonight, and win big. There was a groan from one of the miners at the table. Another round, and that Sabak pot was mine, he said, shaking his head. You're lucky you came up when you did, he added, speaking to the commander. Des knew it wasn't luck. The miner had been so excited he was twitching in his seat. Anyone with half a brain could see he was working toward a powerful hand. The commander had seen it and made his move, cutting the hand short and chopping the other gambler's hopes off at the knees. That's it, the miner said, pushing away from the table. I'm tapped out. Good. Looks like now's your chance, Groshik whispered. Under his breath, as he swept past to pour another drink. Good luck. Good luck. I don't need luck tonight, Des thought. He crossed the floor of the cantina and stepped over the nano silk rope into the Oro-controlled gaming room. And that's the end of Chapter 2. We will probably be reading Chapter 3... Yeah, I'd say we'll probably read Chapter 3 and 4 tomorrow. Yeah. We'll see about reading Chapters 2 and 3 tomorrow. So, this was a good read tonight. This is a good start. Very excited, as you can... I'm not sure if you can tell, but I'm very excited about this book, this trilogy. I've been meaning to read this trilogy for quite some time. I had a hard time finding all the books, but now that I have all 3 books, I am excited about reading this book trilogy to you guys. So, thank you all for those that have stayed and listened. I will be back tomorrow to continue reading this book, as well as the next book. So, hope you all have a good night, and if you like this video, please like and subscribe to my channel. Please share my videos with everyone, especially my previous videos like the Shadow and Bone trilogy, which took a few years, but you know what? We got it done. I'm working on there's another book I'm working on that's only going to take maybe a couple days, and then I don't have to worry about that book anymore. But this month is Star Wars month, so our focus for right now is Star Wars. But I will be back to reading the Ritual. The Last Days. I'll be going back to reading that book shortly. So, if you all enjoyed this, again, if you all enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to my channel. We are nearing 200 subscribers. If you have an opportunity, please subscribe to my channel to help it grow. I want to succeed in this as much as the next person. So if you can, please hit the subscribe button, like this video, comment down below what your thoughts are on the book. If you've read the book before, let me know what your thoughts are. So, hope you all enjoyed it. We'll see you all in the next video. This is the Epileptic Explorer, and I hope you all have a fantastic evening.